Welcome to my Tudorcon talk for 2025. We are looking at love, language, and lyric in Tudor England, and this is a workshop on the historical significance of the sonnet and also some exercises for writing sonnets of you. My name is Emily K. Michael, and I am a poet and writing teacher, so naturally I am very enthusiastic about poetry of any era, but I've decided to explore today my love of poetry alongside my love of all things Tudor. So that's what we're going to be talking about. So in this presentation, we're going to look at a couple of different things. We're looking at the historical significance of sonnets. We're looking at the importance of poetry in the Tudor court. We're looking at elements of the sonnet form, and we're also looking at exercises for aspiring peers. There's a lot of detail we could go into, but we do have a time constraint. So if you're someone who is dying to know more, I will have contact info at the end of the slideshow. But it's really challenging to constrain myself to 30 minutes because there's a million things we could talk about. So these are some of the major areas we're going to discuss today. So did poetry matter at the Tudor court? Historians will give a resounding yes, and so will Tudor enthusiasts. Even in popular media like the Tudors or Wolf Hall, you have tons of scenes of people scribbling away and writing verses, and they're always talking about verses, and certain names come up over and over again. So this is kind of a resounding yes question. But I want to turn specifically to a letter from Ambassador Chapuis, who of course is the imperial ambassador to England at the time. And it's one of the letters that came out around Anne Boleyn's execution. So he has a letter he wrote to Emperor Charles V on May 19th, 1536, which is of course Anne Boleyn's execution day. And in this letter, he's kind of reviewing some of the circumstances that led to her trial and her downfall. And he talks about the men that were accused with her and how that was all received. But he specifically mentions that she is said to have criticized three things about the king. And whether or not we agree with the truth of what he's saying, we know that Chapuis does not say stuff that is so outlandish that it could not be believed by the emperor, because his job was to report the truth as he saw it in England. So in the letter, he famously says that Anne and George Boleyn mocked the king's clothing, his manner of dress, and they even mocked his poetry. We have this amazing quote where it says, "It may have been certain ballads that the king has composed, which the putain," Anne Boleyn, that's his nasty term for her, "and her brother laughed at as foolish things, which was objected to them as a great crime." So the thing that is interesting to me as a poet and as someone who loves poetry is the fact that poetry is placed on equal footing with the way that the king styles himself through his clothing and his ability to produce an air. Now, obviously, as a king, he really needs to produce an air. That's a big deal. But he also needs to style himself as a king. And then the fact that his poetry is regarded as equal to those two things, it's literally mentioned in conversation with those two things, that struck me as unique because, again, who cares if Henry's a bad poet? But apparently that's significant enough to mention. So it must matter that he writes well. And so we can think about poetry as a sign of a gentleman's virility as well as his wit and education. And it wasn't just confined to men, as we're about to see, but again, the fact that poetry was such a status symbol in terms of, your reputation, it got my attention. I thought this is a really cool way to dig into, did it matter? Yes, it did. And, it actually ends up in some imperial correspondence. So I think that's significant. So if we're looking at poets and poetry in the Tudor court and beyond, there are names that you will recognize, I'm sure. We know that Henry VIII composed poetry and music. We know that Anne Boleyn composed some poetry. She famously inscribed her Book of Hours with a couplet. And we know that Elizabeth I wrote poetry. We also know our famous sonneteers. We know Wyatt, Surrey, Sidney, and of course Shakespeare. And Shakespeare was not a courtier. So by his time, sonnets were a very popular form. And we can think about the fact that Shakespeare published 150 sonnets at a time when his plays actually weren't super popular. But for him to do that, it had to have already been established as a form. So we're not looking at a brand new form here. It's kind of like social media. If you think about the fact that Twitter was able to exist because Facebook already existed, right? So Shakespeare is able to flourish with the sonnet and get a book published because we already established sonnets as something that people write. And then we can also think about the Devonshire manuscript, which is this really cool collection of collaborative work. So it was curated by ladies of Anne Boleyn's chamber, her privy chamber. Margaret Douglas, Mary Shelton, and others contributed to this thing. It was a really exciting collection of work. Basically, people wrote in the margins, this poem is really good, or this poem stinks. And it was collaborative. It was this incredible collaborative poetic endeavor. So poetry is not just written by the guys. The Devonshire manuscript shows that it was a female act as well. And so that's pretty exciting. So we have officially entered into a discussion of some poetic concepts. And for those new to poetry or those who have forgotten their high school English, I'm going to remind you of a few terms. So we're not going to go in exhausting detail. Maybe you'll be exhausted, but I'm not. But we will talk about meter, which of course is a poetic rhythm. It's a poem's pace. A lot of times when I'm working with my students, I have students walk the meter of a poem. So they'll take a poem and they'll read it and then we'll walk it around. A lot of times when you walk with a poem, you understand its meter a lot better because a poem does have a heartbeat essentially, and we want to find that. Iambic pentameter is a fancy way of saying it's a line of 10 syllables, and the stresses are on the even numbered syllables. So 2, 4, 6, 8, and 10. We're going to have lots of examples of that. So it sounds kind of challenging and abstract right now, but we'll look at some examples. This matters because this is the essential meter of sonnets, and it has often been talked about as sort of a really intuitive meter for English, like a heartbeat of works in English, because the rhythm that you're going to hear in iambic pentameter sounds like a heartbeat. So actors and poets alike have a lot of fun with that. It's exciting. We love it. We're like, this is native to English. It sounds very natural. And so it lends itself really well to the sonnet form. And when we talk about stress, we're talking about emphasis. So a word like meter has 2 syllables, and the stress is falling on the first syllable. So it just is the part of the word that sounds a little bit louder if you're saying the word to yourself. That's all stress is. It's not anything to get complicated about. When we talk about a poem's rhyme scheme, we're talking about the pattern of rhymes in a poem. And again, if you throw yourself back to your high school days, it's where we label each new rhyme with a letter. So A, B, B, C, C, D, D, things like that. It's not essential to sit and map out the rhyme scheme of a poem unless you're writing something formal like a sonnet. And again, we will talk about that in more detail. This is probably my favorite term here, the volta. The volta is a poem's turning point. So in the sonnets that we're going to look at, the volta can be in 2 different places, but it's a really exciting point at which the poem, the ground beneath you kind of shifts and you realize that we're doing something different than we thought we were doing. It's the moment when the poem kind of reveals something to you that makes you look back up at the previous lines and think, well, how did the poet get there? And so that is the volta. It's the turning point. And again, we're going to look at where that goes, depending on the type of sonnet that we're actually writing. So I've got some examples of iambic pentameter. I wrote these myself. They are not super poetic, but I wanted to show you what they look like with everyday language. We will look at a sonnet by Thomas Wyatt later, and that's much more elevated language, but these are much more everyday. So I've underlined the parts that are stressed. Again, stress being emphasis. You're going to hear that it's where the language naturally has a peak or it's a little bit louder. So the first line says, I went to work, but left my lunch at home. And again, went, work, left, lunch, and home are going to get a little bit more volume or emphasis when we're reading the line naturally. To think, I danced all night with someone sweet. You'll see in this one, iambic pentameter is not bound by words, it's bound by syllables. So when you're writing, you can move words around to get the syllable in the right place. The word someone, this is not on the slide, this is extra knowledge. The word someone is what's called a trochee. It's a 2-syllable pattern that has the stress on the first syllable. But when you are playing with iambic pentameter, you can use trochees. You're not confined to using words that are 2 syllables with the stress on the second syllable. You can use all sorts of poetic patterns to create your lines because it's about knowing where the stresses are. The next one says, The tulips blooming brightly in the yard. Again, a word like tulips is another word just like someone. The stress is actually on the first syllable, and so is blooming and brightly in that line. But we know where to place them in a line of iambic pentameter so that the stress is the most useful to us. And the last one says, alone I watch the sky grow thick with stars. So again, I've underlined the parts that get the stress. And you may think, gosh, this is really weird or it's really complicated. It's challenging until you get it in your head, and then you can use one line of iambic pentameter to help you write multiple lines. It's the kind of thing that once you hear it, you've got it. So we want to practice, practice, practice. It's the kind of thing that you just have to sit and practice on your own. And there's no shame in taking a line that somebody else has written and completely riffing on it until you've written 8 or 9 versions of it. That's what poets do. There was it's fun to learn to speak. There was a practice in the Renaissance called imitatio, and the idea was that you learned best by imitating others. So when we think about our modern ideas about like mashups or parody or anything that sort of picks up what somebody else has done and does a version of it, that's not new, that is old. And the Renaissance poets loved to riff on what other poets had done. So why does iambic pentameter matter? It matters because it's the foundational rhythm for sonnets. If you remember, again, most of us studied these in high school. If you remember back to Shakespeare's Sonnet 18, shall I compare thee to a summer's day? That whole thing is written in 14 lines of iambic pentameter. So it's always 14 lines. There are modern sonnets that are sometimes 15 lines or 13 lines, but we're going to be strict here. We're going to follow the rules until we have gotten it, and then we're going to break all of them. Sonnets were developed in English, and I should have bolded the word in English, by Wyatt, Surrey, and Shakespeare, but they originated in Italy with writers like Petrarch. So you'll see the word Petrarchan coming up, and that's who we're talking about. So we do have English and Italian sonnets, but we're going to talk mostly about English sonnets today, but I'll give you the building blocks of an Italian sonnet, just in case you decide to be adventurous and you want to write one. They're traditionally love poems. They're often called poetic prisons. So a sonnet, because of its 14 lines, is pretty short and deals conventionally with love themes. And so that means that it's going to talk about the ache and pain of love and the suffering of love, a lot of courtly love type language. So a lot of times it's referred to as a prison or a poetic prison because the form is very strict. And so the form is like a little poetic jail, and you're kind of locked in there, just figuring out your life. But it's also called a little song. So I like the idea of it being a prison and a song, kind of handling the difficulties and the joys of life at the same time. And there's a legacy of sonnets beyond the Renaissance. So we don't have time to explore all of them today, but there are modern sonneteers. People are still using this form. It's really cool. Writers like Gwendolyn Brooks, St. Vincent Millay, Seamus Heaney. A lot of people are still writing sonnets. They still appeal to people, I think, because the form is very strict. It kind of forces you to be creative in a way that you didn't think you could. So this is my comparison of English and Italian sonnets, if you just decide you want to try both. The Italian sonnets came first, so they probably should be on the left, but I made it alphabetical. They are both comprised of 14 lines of iambic pentameter. So we just had some examples of iambic pentameter. In a sonnet, whether it's English or Italian, you get 14 lines. I'll go over the English one first. You have 3 quatrains. A quatrain is a group of 4 lines, so that's 12 lines. And then a couplet, which is 2 lines. The rhyme scheme tends to follow the quatrain. So you'll see all kind of variations, but this is the most common one. The A, B, B, A, C, D, D, C. I'm not going to read that whole thing. The volta, remember the turning point, the volta is found in the couplet. So I kind of feel like when you're reading an English sonnet, the volta is like you're turning the key in the lock and you're really opening it up. It's literally like a punch. A lot of Shakespeare sonnets end that way. You think he's going in one direction, and then he gets to the volta, and all of a sudden, oh my God, he was talking about something completely different. And these are usually called Shakespearean sonnets. They're also English sonnets, but Shakespeare wrote a lot of them. So with the Italian sonnet, you have something that's, I think of as a little more of an organic form. I tend to prefer them myself. It's an octave, which is 8 lines, plus a sestet, which is 6 lines. So instead of 3 groups of 4 and then a couplet, you have a group of 8 and then a group of 6. And so what that means in terms of what the sonnet can do, it's kind of cool. Instead of the 3 quatrain setting up a turning point in the couplet, the octave is going to ask something and the sestet is going to answer it. Or the octave is going to make a case and then the sestet is going to refute it. So that volta, that turning point, is actually going to occur between those two. And good poetry doesn't ever just turn rapidly. It's kind of like driving a car. You have to negotiate the turn. So sometimes the volta might kind of start creeping in around line 7 or even line 6. It's kind of prepping you for that. And then we're going to turn our focus. So again, instead of turning the key in the lock in the final 2 lines, we're going to slowly negotiate a turn between the first 8 lines and the last 6. So these are often called Petrarchan sonnets. And again, that's because the most famous author of Italian sonnets was Petrarch, hanging out in Italy, writing about his lady love, and her name was Laura. So Petrarch is very famous for giving us all the motifs of the deer and the hunter as he was pursuing his beloved. So the sonnet has certain themes. It's, like I said before, it's conventionally a love poem. It doesn't have to be. A lot of times love and hate run right next to each other. So you can also have love sonnets, you can have hate sonnets. But we're going to see a lot of courtly love language, especially in the sonnets of the Tudor period. In later years, like when John Donne is picking up the sonnet, he turns romantic love into spiritual love. So you get a lot of really ecstatic spiritual poetry. It's really beautiful. But right now we're dealing with courtly love, and that means some of the most we think of them as kind of trite themes today, but the unattainable lady, the hunter the lover as a hunter, the beloved as a wild, beautiful creature that just cannot be attained. Usually it's a doe or a hind, but there's always pursuit, right? Desire as pursuit, desire as painful, but worthy emotion. So it's a travail, but it's worth going through. And sometimes the more you're suffering, the more you're in love. Kind of a problematic idea today if we think about it. Like if we think of a relationship as suffering, that could be bad. But at the time it was like, oh, my love is causing me pain, so I'm really in love. It's really worth it. And then of course you're always comparing the beloved to some sort of celestial or divine being. This is where, she shines like a star. She's gorgeous. She is absolutely beautiful in otherworldly terms. And that's, again, a mark of how much you love her. So here is famous sonnet from the Tudor era. And if the language looks challenging or weird, that's because we're looking at early modern English. A lot of people think Shakespeare and his pals wrote in Old English. I'm here to prove you wrong. They did not. They wrote in early modern English. And so the language is going to look a little challenging. There are some terms here that we don't really use anymore. List, for example, whoso list to hunt. Basically, whoever wants to hunt. I know where there's a deer. I'm going to let this gentleman read the poem to you.
Whoso list to hunt, I know where is an hind, but as for me, alas, I may no more. The vain travail hath wearied me so sore, I am of them that farthest cometh behind. Yet may I by no means my wearied mind draw from the deer, but as she fleeth afore, fainting, I follow, I leave off, therefore, sithens in a net, I seek to hold the wind. Who list her hunt, I put him out of doubt, as well as I may spend his time engraving with diamonds. In letters plain there is written, her fair neck round about, noli ne tangere, for Caesar's I am, and wild to hold, though I seem tame.
So before we go to our next slide and we talk about what we see in this poem, this is Thomas Wyatt, famous poet of the Tudor court. He theoretically had a relationship with Anne Boleyn. Whether they actually were lovers or everybody just thought they were, the jury is still out on that. But in this poem, he is talking about how Anne is now dating, if you can say dating. She's now with Henry VIII. And so he says, don't touch me, right? The Latin phrase there means don't touch me, because Caesar's I am. So she belongs to the king now, and he should not, in all rationality, he should not pursue her. That would not be a good idea for him. And so I chose this one. The language is very elevated. It's archaic, and it can be really challenging. So this is not like the most accessible sonnet we could have chosen, but it's unusual because outside of the Tudor verse, most people have not heard of it. But also it points to a very specific historical and political moment in which Wyatt has to set his own desires aside and leave Henry to Anne Boleyn. Or leave Anne to Henry. And what's interesting is he borrows a lot of conventions from Italian sonnets, and he renders them in the English form. And so Wyatt is actually riffing on Petrarch here. So Petrarch wrote a version of this that has no reference to Anne Boleyn, obviously. And then Wyatt picked it up and decided he was going to write this really cool, politically resonant poem. It's also very personal. So it's a moment when poetry responded to the real world in a very coded way. And that's exciting to me, because again, a lot of people think of poetry as just some textbook thing, or it's just something we do in private and it has no resemblance to the real world, but we know that it can, and we know that it does. So what do we see in this poem by Thomas Wyatt? We see those courtly love themes. The unattainable lady is now a deer or a hind. She has moved beyond his sphere. She's no longer someone that he can have a relationship. She says, for Caesar's I am. Love as pain. Again, we're in the prison of the sonnet, the pain prison. The vain travail have wearied me so sore. So as a poet, I love travail and also vain travail, so that it's worthless travail. And then wearied is such a wonderful word, because again, he's tired, right? This has worn him out. And then we also see courtship as hunting, and Henry VIII would love that metaphor because he loved to hunt. But again, he says in the very first line, if you like to hunt, I know where there's a deer. However, right, pursue her at your peril. So he's worn out by this endeavor, but it was worth it. But, obviously he chose to write about it, so it was worth it. But there's a lot of heartache in this poem that he pursued someone who is now being pursued by a much more significant hunter, and therefore she's beyond him. She's officially unattainable. So rather than look at a million more sonnets, because we just don't have the time to explore them, I wanted to recommend some practices that I thought would be useful to you in writing your own. And so I divided these into two approaches, and you might be skeptical as to whether they're going to work for you. And so I just ask you to put your faith in them if you decide you want to be a sonneteer. The first is sort of a practice of inspiration. And this is traditional. We think, I want to write a poem. I need to feel inspired. So I've asked you to kind of think about all the ways that you would channel that inspiration. So this is where you think about someone or something that you love or hate, because again, it can be a hate poem too. Gather associations, sketch, journal, talk into a recorder. A lot of times we kind of underestimate the power of talking it out, especially in a file that no one else is going to see. Let your strong feelings lead you to something. So memories, stories, wells of inspiration are usually richly emotional. You've got something to say. What is it that you want to say? Who is it that you want to write for? Sometimes it helps to meditate on a person, especially someone who you haven't talked to in a while or someone you miss. But think about what you really feel compelled to say. And if you think you have nothing to say, then the next slide is for you. But I suspect that most of us have something to say. It's 500 years since the Tudor court, and people are still writing sonnets. And poetry is much, much older than sonnets, and we're all still writing that. So don't worry if you come up with so much material that you don't have room for it in your 14 lines, because again, what doesn't fit in this poem will fit in another one. And write it all down. Just write it all down. No one will see your draft. No one will see how terrible it is. No one's going to judge you based on the quality of your material, your journaling, or your draft. And a lot of times we have that internal editor really turned on, and it prevents us from making art. So just write everything down. You never know whether later on it will become something that you want it to be. And the second approach is a technical practice. So this is the one that I said you might be skeptical about because it feels like you're just spinning your wheels. But I think about it like this. If you're learning to cook, you don't go in the kitchen and immediately create masterpieces. You create basic dishes and you learn to do the techniques that are involved in the kitchen. So you learn to cut vegetables, you learn to stir without something burning, you learn to sort things, learn to get your ingredients out there and just ready for assembly. So draft lines of iambic pentameter. I know it's weird and kind of archaic, and who talks like that, right? Who writes like that? But it's going to prepare you to enter the poetic prison of the sonnet. It's going to prepare you for that musical form and allow you to really live in it and let it be something. Take lines that other people have written and riff on them. Nobody cares. It's going to be a way for you to practice and to get the rhythm really embedded in your head. It's almost like writing song lyrics. You know what the constraints are, and it's going to help you to really feel like you can live in that form and it's not intimidating. Once you have, I would say, 4 to 6 lines, then you can start to think about whether they actually can knit together. If we were to scroll back to that slide where I wrote some samples for you, I wrote those because I thought, well, these are kind of weird and different, but maybe they could actually connect together. So if you don't feel like there's a way to pull them together, just keep writing lines of iambic pentameter and then start kind of a word cloud based on rhymes. Because again, the sonnet is a rhyming form. So we want to know what rhymes with what. And if we start to kind of pull those rhymes together, we might find that there's a story we actually want to tell that we didn't even know about. So these are just 2 different ways to approach writing a sonnet to make the process a little less intimidating. Because again, a lot of times people think, well, I could never be a poet. I don't know how to do that. We all start somewhere, and you can all start with something as simple as just writing some lines. Even if no one ever sees them, even if they're so terrible that you crumple them and you throw them in your trash can, at least there's not an ambassador sitting there to tell everyone how bad they are. So that's all I have for you for today. If you want to know more, I have a QR code that will lead you to a resource page I've assembled. I've pulled together some podcast episodes, interviews, web links about Tudor poetry, Tudor poets, and writing of sonnets. And that's a live page, so I'm constantly adding to it. So bookmark it if it's really what is exciting to you, and you will see that I will add more links to it. And then I also have my own website linked there, and it's named after me, so it's easy for you to find, but it's just emilykmichael.com. And it's where I put all of my poetry and writing. So if you are interested in hearing more from me, that's where you can go to find more of my work.